We've heard a lot about bias, culture, and leadership, which are kind of broad topics today. Hopefully everyone's gotten some insights that they can take home when it comes to tackling those issues. And all those topics come together today sort of as part of the From Day One common thread, which, of course, is people. And when it comes to the story we tell as a conference series, as a company, our focus is on people, and there's nothing more important as the topic of our next session. In a conversation on what kindness has to do with inclusivity, UCLA Dean and Professor Darnell Hunt will chat with our very own Steve Koepp about the new Kindness Institute and offer insights into the school's authoritative Hollywood Diversity Report. Up next is what kindness has to do with inclusivity. Please join me in welcoming Darnell Hunt and Steve Koepp. Thanks, guys.
Hello, everyone. That's probably kind of a puzzling title, what does kindness have to do with inclusivity, because we don't use kindness in this context much, but it will become apparent as we talk. Professor Darnell Hunt, who's Dean of the Social Sciences at UCLA, is also a professor of sociology and African American studies. He wears many hats, as you can see. He is also the author of the Hollywood Diversity Report, which is the annual series that examines the relationship between diversity and profit in the entertainment industry. And profit is something that Hollywood cares about. But the newsiest thing is Dean Hunt's department will be the home of the new Badari Kindness Institute, which was endowed to the tune of $20 million by a couple of philanthropists. And my first question is, Dean, to you, why now for kindness? Is this a moment?
Well, if it wasn't obvious, we live in very polarized times. We have lots of questions plaguing us about how we treat our fellow human beings. There's the issue of immigration and what's been happening on the border. There's the question of women and how they're treated in society. There are any number of issues that are longstanding issues, but I think we've reached a point now where some of these things are critical in terms of their importance, and we need to look at them in very structured, measured ways. And one of the things that we excel at UCLA is doing research. And our division is very broad. We have 18 different academic units, and we study everything from archaeology to economics to gender studies, ethnic studies, sociology, my department, political science, and we have something to say. And so we wanted to take a concept like kindness and figure out how we could study that scientifically.
So it's not just pure research to understand it better, but it's also kind of applied in the sense of you're looking for an outcome. Is it possible for kindness to become contagious or groups to be more kind?
So the faculty director for our new institute, Professor Daniel Fessler, is an evolutionary anthropologist. And he kind of studies the evolution of the human species, really, and how they build community, build societies. And one of the questions he's interested in is exactly what you just said, the degree to which kindness spreads, or what they call contagious pro-sociality. And so what he does is a number of different types of experiments trying to understand the conditions under which people are kind to one another. And they just published a paper. I'm not an expert in this area, but it's a very interesting paper. It's on a concept called elevation. And what that is basically is when you see someone engaged in a random act of kindness, under certain circumstances, people copy that behavior. It's sort of, and what they're learning is that it changes the definition of the situation. It makes people feel like they're a part of something greater than themselves, and people interpret that in different ways, and culturally in different cultures it's interpreted in different ways, but it's a phenomenon that we see in lots of different cultures. And so they're studying the conditions under which it's likely to happen, and the converse, under which it's likely not to happen. Mm-hmm. And so we also think that harm and sort of treating people poorly is something that also can be copied if people are given the permission to do so. And so that's one of the issues that I think resonates with our current time. If it becomes common to treat people as less than human, then that opens the door for people to do all kinds of acts that they might not have done before. And so we're trying to study the conditions under which it's more or less likely that these things will happen, and then to be able to make recommendations about policies that might encourage pro-sociality as opposed to negative ways of treating people.
It seems like in times of great division and suspicion, it might be like turning a battleship around in terms of like really changing things. But now, certain things like qualities like maybe charity and other sociological concepts probably might be measurable in ways like how much money did people give or something more quantifiable, but kindness is a little more squishy, and we know it when we see it. This is a holiday time and we watch It's a Wonderful Life and we can get, oh, that's,
right.
I get it. But how do you go about it in a kind of a clinical or academic way of looking at it?
Sure. Well, the wonderful thing about what we do is that kindness is a very broad concept. I mean, there are a number of different ways that you could operationalize something known as kindness. So we might even ask a question like, what would a kind economy look like? What types of characteristics would that economy have? As opposed to an economy that was based on a winner-takes-all philosophy that, that assumes that the most efficient and effective way to power society is by giving people kind of unfettered access to whatever they can accumulate. Well, there are certain benefits associated with that, but there are also certain negatives. And part of what we would study is under what conditions do people respond in different ways within the economy. So we have an economics department, for example, in our division, and we have people who study the economy more broadly and different pieces of it. The beauty of the Institute is that for the first time, we now have a structure which is enabled by the $20 million gift to incentivize researchers to collaborate on projects that individually they might not have done. And so we have evolutionary anthropologists working with economists, working with sociologists, working with psychologists, and people from the medical school, and people from the life sciences who study the brain and the way that we recognize and filter information and respond to people who look like ourselves or maybe don't look like us. I mean, all of these things are small pieces of this bigger puzzle that we are now able to bring together with a team of scientists who can study different questions. Now, that's basic research that gets published in academic journals or in books that may be a bit technical for the general population. So another aspect of the gift is it allows us to hire an executive director and a team of people who now will translate the basic research into terms that lay people can understand. They have a mandate to work with the media to really get the findings of this research out into the general public and to work with elected officials and policymakers to impact the types of policies that at the end of the day will create more humane societies. And that's one of the core elements of the mission of the Institute, is to provide scientific knowledge about creating more humane societies.
I don't think you'll have trouble getting the word out, because just when you said that you had like a kindness institute, there was headlines all over. But there will be experiments where people are kind of like lab rats, where like there's that marshmallow test of delayed gratification with the kids, and they're told you can have this one marshmallow right now, but if you wait, you can get two, and so it's that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, there'll be a range of different types of work. And we have. There are protocols in place these days that make it very difficult to design studies that infringe upon the rights of the subjects. I mean, so all major research universities have what are known as IRB boards, institutional review boards, that scrutinize any research plan. Before you can go out in the field and collect data, it has to be approved, and there's a board of people who have expertise on these topics to ensure that the people participating in your study aren't harmed. Okay, with that caveat, yes, I mean, there'll probably be lots of different types of experiments that are meant to study how people respond under different conditions, to pinpoint, insights as to why people tend to be kind or not. For one thing, we know there's a body of literature that already exists that one of the first steps toward kindness is empathy. If you don't empathize with people, if you don't see them as human, if you don't understand their basic humanity, you're much less likely to be kind to them. So what types of things get in the way of us seeing the humanity of others? Well, often race, gender in some cases, religion. I mean, there are a number of social categories and cultural identities that, depending upon where people are coming from, may infringe upon their ability to see other people as fellow humans. And so we can study those things. We study those things in sociology. But what we haven't done is gotten together with people who study the brain and how the brain functions, and the degree to which certain types of behavior cause us to be more or less depressed, and how that then affects the way we react to other people. So all of these things are related. And thus far, we've looked at small pieces of it in isolation. Now we're bringing it all together to get at these big picture questions that have the ability to help us think about, again, more humane societies.
Well, you've already delivered on what the premise of the panel is in terms of like people other than ourselves and seeing them as human and equal. I'm just wondering, is there a little bit more the dynamic of inclusivity, like let's say in an office environment or in any organization? What's the disincentive to being kind or inclusive? Is it fear, or is it there's some risk involved? Let's say you're in the in-group and you risk something to reach out to the out-group and make a person an ally, right? Is that the...
Yeah. Well, there are a number of different ways that people can be unkind. So I have a colleague in sociology who studies genocide, and she studied the Holocaust. She studies the Holocaust, and she studies specifically why it is some people who were otherwise good people went along with it. What allowed them to sort of go against everything that their conscience may have otherwise told them to do to participate in this and to be able to sleep at night. Part of being able to sleep restfully is that we're at peace with our conscience on some level. Well, how is it that people are able to do that under certain circumstances? So what she finds, of course, is that certain types of authority give people cover to do things that they might not otherwise do. So if you have people in positions of authority who are seen as legitimate, who say that it's okay to do certain things, then you're much more likely to do them. To be unkind, for example.
Yeah.
Or whatever other adjectives you may use to describe that type of behavior. Conversely, if you say it's okay to be kind and that you're not a sucker and that you're not just, weak or all these other adjectives that are often associated with not being ruthless in business or in certain circumstances, then you're more likely to entertain the possibility that you can be successful in whatever your endeavor happens to be, and also thoughtful about the humanity of other people. So I guess what I'm saying is that there are cultural norms that shape the way we interpret any situation. And in business and in certain types of organizations, if it's rewarded to act in, for lack of a better term, ruthless ways, where you're not thinking about these other things, or these other things are seen as luxuries that get in the way of you being effective, then you're much less likely to think in ways that lead to kindness.
And we're not talking about anyone specific in current events or anything, of course, no.
Of course, we won't name names,
But since we went there. Is kindness political in the sense? And if
absolutely, yeah.
And well, as you said, some people say, liberals, conservatives are mean and liberals are suckers, as you were alluding to. That's the old thing. But if you, in the carrying out of this with some academic rigor, how do you wade through that territory? And when we talked earlier, you said there's academic freedom. If we discover that kindness tells you something else, that's the path you follow, right? I mean, in terms of politics.
Yeah. So this may be a segue to the Hollywood diversity.
Oh,
stuff.
right, if you like.
I mean, and so I'm going to use that example to kind of hopefully illustrate. So I'm a sociologist, and I've studied race and media for at least 2 decades, and I'm principally interested in media because of its ability to shape the way we perceive reality. And there's a lot of research on what happens, comparing people who are, quote, heavy users of media to those who aren't, and how the heavy media users tend to perceive the world in ways that are more closely aligned with the images that circulate in media compared to the people who aren't heavy users. I mean, that's research that's been validated over and over and over again since the 60s. It's a huge body of literature on that. So from my perspective, I'm interested in the way that media influence racial politics and the quality of people's lives and so forth. But the focus of the work I was doing was on Hollywood diversity, and Hollywood's like, they call it show business for a reason because it's about making money. And so, the societal piece is interesting, but at the end of the day, we care about the bottom line. So bringing the two conversations together. We were able to show with our Hollywood Diversity Report, which does look at the relationship between diversity and the bottom line, that diversity does in fact sell. And it's okay to be inclusive. In fact, if you're inclusive, at the end of the day, you stand to make more money. And we were able to demonstrate that. So in other words, I mean, one way of thinking about that is a kinder and inclusive work environment, because we're talking about workspaces that were very hostile to women and people of color. Making them kinder and more inclusive actually serves other goals that before this time were associated with being ruthless, cutthroat, and not caring about those things. So, I mean, I think similar relationships probably exist in other arenas within society where it was previously thought that the way to get ahead was to cut people off and to, you know, hoard everything for yourself, when in fact, another strategy of being more inclusive, more thoughtful about people at the end of the day will actually maximize the benefit that accrues from your work.
Tell a little bit about what it was like to start this. This will be your 7th year when you come out with a report in February. So years ago you started this, and you're kind of starting from scratch. And how did you pursue that?
So my own personal involvement in this goes back to the early 90s. 1992, LA was home to the 1992 LA uprisings. I don't use the word riots for a reason, because those words tend to be politicized, but that's another story. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights routinely studies these types of urban uprisings, and LA was no exception. So they came out to LA in the aftermath of 1992 to try to understand what the causes were, to get a sense of what the tensions were in LA that led to the outburst. And they have a whole series called Tensions in American Urban Communities, blah, blah, blah. So at the time, I was actually a PhD student. I was working on sort of thinking about my dissertation topic, which I knew was going to have something to do with race and media. And I was pretty sure at that point that what had happened in 1992 was going to be my case study. And I was downtown, actually, not too far from here, at the LA Commission on Human Rights, meeting with people there. They had done a survey of local news coverage of 1992 and actually had sort of ranked who did the best in terms of, you know, reasonable, balanced coverage. And I wanted to see the survey because I wanted to reference it in my dissertation as background, because part of my study was looking at media coverage and studying people across race, gender, socioeconomic class, to see how they were differentially interpreting what was happening and how that aligned with media frames of what was happening. So that was the project. So just so happened, I happened to be in the office when the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was there asking, well, do you have someone here in LA who, you know, is conversant with what's happening in Hollywood and media, who can kind of be a chaperone to take us around to studios and networks, because we want to also take a look at Hollywood, because we had done a series of studies in the late 1970s, and we think that, you know, media images may have something to do with this as well, in terms of depicting certain communities in certain ways and so forth. So that's how I made the connection. They ended up, you know, I became a staffer for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and I spent about a year going to every single movie studio and network and employment guild, the Writers Guild, Screen Actors Guild, meeting with individual actors, writers, producers, and really getting a firsthand accounting of sort of what's happening on the front lines with respect to diversity and inclusion. I also met with a few academics who were studying this, and many of them were sociologists, and I ended up taking over the reports that they were doing at the time, you know, once I became a professor. But that was the beginning of my interest. But what became obvious in all those years of doing that work was that there was no definitive account of what was actually happening in terms of diversity. Nothing that was objective, that was reliable, that we could follow from year to year and say with certainty that yes, we're making progress, or no, we aren't. A lot of what we knew was anecdotal. So that was kind of the origin or the
real
genesis
data,
of this.
and
real data
study,
that was hard, that the industry could say, okay, collectively, this is the authoritative source of data on diversity, and the goal was to get everyone to see the report as that and to start a dialogue about what needs to happen.
And this was very exhaustive, and when you came out with your first report, what was the reaction, and what surprised you about it?
So we spent about 2 years prior to designing the report just to find out from people who were stakeholders, decision makers, what would move the needle. If there were to be a report that you pay attention to, what do you want to see? And what we kept hearing was, if you can tie it to the bottom line, if you can show how profit is dependent upon this, then people will take notice. And so that's what we did, basically. So initially there was, I won't name names, but there were a couple of studios and networks that joined immediately, said, yeah, this is great, and in fact, we're going to reach out to our counterparts at this network or studio and introduce you so that you can call on them, and hopefully they'll support you as well. So rather than go to foundations for funding, which is what we normally do at a research university like UCLA, we decided up front that we're going to ask the industry itself to fund this. And what we did was, and our rationale was, if they have skin in the game, they're more likely to read the report and to take ownership, claim it, and so forth and so on. But it was tricky. We didn't want our report to be seen as biased or not independent, so we capped how much we would take from any single studio or network to a nominal amount. And our hope was to sign up all the major studios and networks, and that would fund the project and also ensure that everyone's reading it, everyone's talking about it, and it becomes the industry standard. And that's essentially what we were able to more or less accomplish. We never signed up every studio network, but we had all the major ones. We had Sony, we had ABC Disney, we had Fox, we had we had Time Warner, we had a number of the employment guilds on board supporting. We had a couple of talent agencies, William Morris, Endeavor, we had ICM, we had Oprah Winfrey Network, Will and Jada Smith Family Foundation, BET, El Rey Network, HBO, and there were others too, but CBS, but you get the idea. I mean, we had a pretty diverse group of supporters, and that immediately made our report, noticeable, and people took notice. And after the first year, when we only had a few supporters, we added new supporters every year. By year 3, reporters were calling us, like, isn't your report coming out soon? What are you guys finding? Whereas the first year, we had to really sell it in terms of what was unique and distinctive about it.
And once it's reported and people read the
and
trade,
now
they read the trades, and
and our main audience was the trades, because we were trying to affect behavior in the industry. I mean, we did the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and LA Times, but our main audience was the trades, because we were trying to affect decision makers in the industry.
So now years go by, and we're seeing lots of high-profile, diverse stars, movies, things like the Black Panther, a monster global success, and Wonder Woman, and Jordan Peele's films. So at least from all that, you would think the world has changed. So I'm wondering, well, how much has, but you take an academic approach and don't just look at those the marquee. What has changed and what still needs to change?
Yeah, well, the good news is there's been a lot of change. The bad news is there's a long way to go. So most of the change we've seen has been in television. Anyone who watches TV these days will know we're in this renaissance of TV. I mean, this is the best point in the history of TV by far. I mean, you see things on TV now that in some cases are better than what you see at the movies. In fact, you have a lot of people who were known as movie stars going to TV because there's just so much to do in TV. Digital streaming on demand has changed everything. Netflix now makes more original programming than any other network by far, which wasn't the case when we started this 7 years ago. Netflix only had like 2 or 3 titles. I think Orange is the New Black and a few other things. Now they have close to 100, and that's like triple what ABC or CBS or NBC does, or HBO, And so the quality is really high, and what that's done is, because they have all this space to fill now, it's created opportunities for women and talent of color who, when you only had 12 new shows a year on the major networks, and you had the same white male producers who were very well known and accomplished, getting all of the opportunities to make new shows, there weren't any openings for new talent. Now we have all these openings. People have made shows, they're winning awards, and there's an appetite now that's been filled. So. The first thing I'll say is the market has shifted radically, in a relatively short period of time, and it will continue to shift because we're a little bit more than 40% people of color now. We've always been slightly more than 50% women, and that diversity is actually driving the market now, whereas it used to be an afterthought. And if you get them, great, but but we're going to go after our core audience, which happen to be white viewers. That's no longer the case. In fact, we can show definitively with our data, and we contract with Nielsen. We have their conventional ratings data as well as their social media, Twitter and Facebook data, which measures engagement with shows, which is another way of thinking about what the impact is, other than just is the TV on. And the social media findings are actually even more pronounced in terms of the impact of diversity in consumption. And if you look at films, we contract with ComScore and a few other companies that survey moviegoers, and we know who bought the tickets, on opening weekend and subsequent weekends. And what we found for the last 3 reports is that if you look at the top 10 Hollywood releases each year ranked by box office, In each of those years, 5 of the top 10 films, the majority of the tickets were bought by people of color. And another 1 or 2 of those films, half the tickets were. And that trend is increasing because we're becoming about 0.5% more diverse each year. And of course, most people know that by 2043 we'll be majority minority. So, the market has shifted radically, and Hollywood, needless to say, doesn't look all that much like the market. And that's part of the problem, this disconnect. And so I think, most of what we've talked about is if you want to remain profitable, if you want to not leave billions on the table, you need to be telling stories that resonate with your audience today and where your audience is going. And that means not only putting those people in front of the camera, but also having them behind the camera in the writers' rooms, directing, and in the executive suites.
And that step gets you not just putting faces of color and diverse faces on shows that were constructed by people who aren't, but actually having people produce them, write them. I was thinking of just because it's a favorite of Donald Glover, who kind of was the mastermind of Atlanta, and that's a really different. It's a really different kind of show. It's innovative, and so you're getting it's not just the faces, it's the actual tone and quality are changing, right?
Yeah, I mean, just there's certain things that are on today that just never would have been on network television, where it used to be in the old days. I forget the ratio, but there was some ridiculous ratio of 300 pilots to 2 or 3 shows that get picked up or something like that. And because the networks, they only had so many hours per day and so many days per week, and there was this fierce competition to get on the schedule. And every show had to produce. If you didn't get those ratings within a few weeks, they'd cancel the show. Well, now you have Netflix, you have Amazon, you have Hulu, and guess what? They don't even report ratings. It's not about the ratings. It's about subscriptions. And they're selling subscriptions around the globe. And they're selling portfolios of products. And if you have a diverse portfolio, you're likely to appeal to more subscribers. So it makes sense for them to have shows that might not be the highest rated show, but it's high quality, it's provocative, it's inclusive, and it's likely to appeal to that subscriber that otherwise wouldn't subscribe to your network. And so that's the difference. It's a different business model that's led to a different way of imagining television, and it's created a demand in audiences that they didn't know they could have before, because they certainly weren't getting it from broadcast television. And the genie can't be put back in the bottle, and it's actually changing the way broadcast TV and cable TV is developing new shows.
We are now in award season. You're starting to get nominations for things, and that's also been an area that's cast a light on diversity, especially the Oscars So White, era of not so long ago. And now the Golden Globe nominations just came out, and there are no women directors among the nominees, even though there are lots of seemingly great candidates. It's kind of stubborn. Is that because Academy members are old, or and maybe they should retire? I don't know.
Yeah, but that's part of it. So there are a number of things going on, and we actually do look at Oscars in our report. And by the way, if any of you are interested in looking at our reports, you can just Google my name and UCLA Hollywood Diversity Report. They're all available online. You can download the full report. All 6 previous reports are also online. So we do look at Oscars, and the reason we look at Oscar nominations and Oscar awards is not just because of the vanity of the project. They actually do, we theorize, have an impact on how things operate in the industry. Because, to win an Oscar is to basically say that you've been affirmed by, your peers in the industry to be of the highest artistic merit, the highest artistic quality. And networks and studios want to be affiliated with projects that are high prestige. And aside from the point I think you were making earlier, Steve, when we were talking in the green room, that these movies actually make a little bit more money too because of their Oscar nomination, because they often re-release the film and people go out and see it right before Oscar. But that's the smaller point. The bigger point is the branding. I mean, studios and networks want to be affiliated with prestige projects. HBO has made that a part of their identity. It's not TV, it's HBO. And one of the things they sell is we win the most Emmys every year or whatever. Although Netflix has been eclipsing them recently, but in any event, it matters. And it shapes sort of who wants to be affiliated with you. It shapes, when something does really well in terms of awards, it kind of says that, okay, this type of project might be considered again. So it does mean something. So the Academy, traditionally has been very white, much older, very male. And the Academy has intentionally, since the Oscar So White moment, attempted to diversify its membership by bringing in new membership cohorts each year that are much larger than in the past and more diverse, with hopes of chipping away at the share of the membership that's not white. And it's a very slow process. Obviously, when you're starting with 6,000 plus members and you're only bringing in a couple hundred a year, you just kind of do the math. I mean, what percent would have to be diverse in order to really have a meaningful impact on the overall diversity? But they're moving in the right direction. So that's part of it. Part of it is the membership, and people have different tastes. People have different experiences. There's nothing wrong with that. People come from different backgrounds, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have a diverse group of people in the room, because I think at the end of the day, you make better projects when people are sharing and you're coming up with a range of different characters and stories and that type of thing. That's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is, what does the Academy have to work with in terms of what it can nominate and ultimately award? If the industry's not making diverse projects, if they're not making projects with women leads, if they're not making projects directed by women, it's kind of hard to nominate and give women Oscars. And so that's a part of the problem too. So it's a two-pronged problem. It's supply on the one hand in terms of what the industry is making, and on the other hand, who's making the decisions about what merits recognition.
Well, we've run out of time, but it sounds like on that final note, you're saying we should have confidence in Generation Z for further change. So that's a
Well,
good.
yeah, to a degree. I mean, I think the industry is still trying to kind of figure out how to continue business as usual, because there are different interests at play. I mean, people who are in control now don't want to just say, "Oh, I'm going to stand aside and let you take over." I mean, they want to maintain doing what they're doing, and they are known for doing a particular type of thing, which doesn't always align with what Generation Z wants. So I think it's going to be an interesting period of transition to see if we get to the point where behind the scenes is as diverse as what we're beginning to see in front of the camera.
All right, well, Dean Hunt, thanks. This is
you.
great.
All right.
Very timely. Appreciate it.